Okay, so this evening, the next installment in the Values and Principles is titled America's Path to Deception. When we started this process of investigation, looking into the Founding Fathers' original principles and values, we had no idea what we would find. The trail we discovered led us into a place where their values and principles were illuminated to us. And it became obvious that their principles were unshakable. Those core values and principles were rooted in their upbringing, in their faith in God, and in standards that had been lost to us over the course of time. So, just to set the record straight, we are reporting what has been documented by those that came before us. Those original documents, papers and letters, books and the like, all point to the same thing. The 250, and I repeat that, 250 original Founding Fathers, for the most part, were God-fearing and strong in faith and made no excuse for what they believed. And because of what we discovered about them, early on we realized just how far we had fallen away from the core values and principles that they held. This then brings us to the next step on this path of understanding just how far removed we are from what they believed. This is the beginning of understanding America's path to destruction. They understood that without firm reliance upon and knowledge of the Bible and God, they would be unable to found a nation that would survive. They understood that man, left to his own devices, becomes vulnerable to deception. And they didn't want that to happen to us. George Washington, in reviewing and making additions to his farewell address, said this, quote, "Ambitious men serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than of consistent and wholesome plans," unquote. Those words, for most of the population of this nation, wouldn't even be able to understand what I just read, much less take it in and thoroughly get the idea. And so he continued and he said, "Cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion." It's as if Washington had a window into the future, because he described exactly what we now have in government. Ambitious, cunning, unprincipled people who are subverting the power of the people, usurping the reins of government that we've entrusted to them, and destroying the very engines which brought them into the positions that they now hold. That brings us to the definition of deception, which includes this: to cause someone to believe as true something that is false, to mislead or lie, an illusion meant to deceive, a trick meant to fraud or sham, dishonesty. In Washington's quote, he used the word cunning, which is a synonym of deceit. And in the very context of this quote, the word ambitious takes on a very negative connotation of seeking after a high position or great power.
Continuing on from what Shar just shared, our enemies have known for a very long time the near impossibility of overthrowing us militarily, for one of our greatest strengths, as we all know, is our military. They have also known that beyond our military, our absolute greatest strength is found in our moral and virtuous people. And as long as we adhere to the principles set forth by our Founding Fathers, who based much of our founding documents on the Bible and the Judeo-Christian ethic, we were undefeatable. Excuse me. However, if that was ever forgotten, ignored, or denied, we would be ripe for not only change, but a total transformation of our nation. That day is here. Vladimir Lenin understood this as well as anybody. He knew that to defeat us, The American culture must be detached from any moral anchor or compass whatsoever. He also understood the power in our founding documents to make and keep us a free people, and that holding fast to the principles upon which we were founded would keep us a people worthy of that freedom. So, in order to separate us from the moral anchor or compass that has kept us so exceptional and strong, our enemy knows they must change the way we feel about, or completely distort through deception, that which our founders understood to be indispensable from our liberty and our freedom. In our last presentation, we listed the main 7 foundational principles that the founders based this country upon. And I want to review this tonight because this is what we're going to build upon for the next part of the presentation. It was the dignity of human life, traditional monogamous marriage, national work ethic, right to a God-centered education, Abrahamic covenant, common decency, and personal accountability to God. So is this a coincidence then, what we're going to talk about in terms of the principles of our founding fathers and what the enemy is going after in terms of fundamentally transforming our nation and how they're going about it? To turn everything upside down, that's the purpose of what the enemy is doing, so that either we no longer believe what we once did, or to get us to believe that what we once believed in no longer exists. In other words, we're talking about the systematic destruction of America as the ultimate goal. Yeah, there we go. Okay, this is the chart that I have in my hand. If you will look on top of the 7 different categories, though they don't perfectly correspond, there is a very significant connection between the founding principles that our nation was formed upon and those 7 categories that are, in fact, are being used, have been infiltrated by the enemy through a process of deception that they now have transitioned into what they stood for and what they stand for now, and how our whole way of thinking has been transformed through their influence in every single one of those categories. And that might not make sense until we get into it further, but hopefully as we move along it will become a little clearer. Truth number 1, as I said, was the dignity of human life. The deceptive transition that took place is not specifically correlated in here, but there are some definite things that correspond with the outcome. By that I mean the feminist movement. If you take the feminist movement, you take now the National Organization of Women, which then led to abortion on demand, which then greatly affected our governmental policy. Where it used to be that we had a strong government policy that supported and defended the sanctity of human life, the dignity of human life, now through this process of the feminist movement, now and the Roe v. Wade law, which then came into place, we now have support of our government for the pro-abortion legislation, which has been in place for a very long time. We also have political correctness, which then affected more or impacted moral relativism, which then impacted Hollywood. Now, moral relativism asserts that morality is not based on any absolute standard, rather ethical truths depend on variables such as the situation, culture, or one's feelings, etc., which is in total contradiction to the founders' beliefs and principles. They believed absolutely in absolute truth, and there was no compromise in that. But now, because of moral relativism, that then has infiltrated Hollywood and other, this is very, let me just say this is kind of broad and general to some degree. It's not real specific, but it's just to kind of give you an overview of the transition that has taken place in the last 100 years that has tainted or affected each one of us in our culture today. And then, of course, movies and TV, which then infiltrated the media, and all of them now send a message that contradicts the absolute dignity of human life that our founders believed so firmly. So, the resulting deception, by that I mean what has happened as a result of that infiltration and the changes that have taken place, is that now the overall belief in our country by many of its citizens, not just its government, is that life is dispensable, it has no real intrinsic value, life can be terminated for the sake of convenience, whether it be abortion or euthanasia, culture no longer respects or honors the elderly but sees them as a burden or an inconvenience. And man is no longer seen as created in the image of God and can therefore be used or abused for the pleasure or purpose of another. Truth number 2 was the monogamous family. The deceptive transition that took place went through the process, and I wish I could keep the slide up simultaneously because it'd make a little bit more sense, but it all started with Karl Marx philosophy, for those of you that saw the video and you remember that. And then the prodigies of Karl Marx, Lenin included in that, and then the different organizations and the different people that formed groups, the Fabians, that sort of thing. And then how then all of that just continued to move on up the chain until we got to the place where we are today, where Barack Obama was put into office as part of the overall as a part of the overall plan for the destruction of our nation, which we're not going to talk about. That's not the point. The point is just to see how this philosophy of Karl Marx, then, as it infiltrated our culture in the last 100 years, and it created things like this political correctness and this moral relativism, how it infiltrated Hollywood, how it infiltrated our media, how it infiltrated our church doctrine, where we now have churches that endorse and support homosexuality, which would have been unheard of in our founders' day. And it not only affects church doctrine again, but as it was with truth number 1, it changes government policy. So I think you kind of get the point that this isn't all, it's not this happened, so this happened, so this happened, and that's what we have here. But overall, this philosophy that has come up through the ranks in our country over the last 100 years, that has gone basically unchallenged by us as American people, has now come to its fruition, where it influences every single one of these principles in such a way that it has transformed not only policies and doctrines and media and Hollywood and all of that, but it's transformed to a great extent the entire American population. So the resulting deception of that is that any self-defined relationship can make up a family. Now, I'm not talking here about aunts and uncles who raise nieces and nephews, or grandparents who raise children. I'm not talking about that. That's not the kind of thing. They are still a family. We're not minimizing that in any way or demeaning that. But we are talking about a new definition of family that is coming from this kind of philosophy that says children are just as happy in a home with 2 moms and dads as they would be in a home with a mom and a dad. As a result of this as well, men are demeaned and not necessary in family life any longer, for the most part. Traditional family is archaic and it's on its way out. Truth number 3, the national work ethic. The deceptive transition that has taken place is, of course, the NEA and the labor unions, which then infiltrate the labor category, the introduction of Social Security, introduction of the income tax, introduction of welfare, the demeaning of power of the welfare, and what has happened as a result of that. The resulting deception then is an entitlement society, which we have very much today, a decrease in personal responsibility to care for oneself and one's family, less people paying for more people to be taken care of, and less pride in personal performance and workmanship. Number 4, the right to a God-centered education. The deceptive transition began in 1876 when the American Liberal Union began taking God out of our history books. Then the Communist Party of USA was established, which then led to the ACLU and the anti-Christian movement. And before we knew it, in 1962, prayer was taken out of schools, the Bible was taken out of schools, the 10 Commandments were out, and the Democratic Socialist of America was firmly established, which then infiltrated and greatly influenced the educational philosophy of this country, as well as government policies related to education. The resulting deception then is that God, instead of having a God-centered education and a right to it, God is no longer allowed in the schools, prayer is not allowed, Bible reading is not allowed, the 10 Commandments is no longer allowed in the public schools. It's all out. Homeschoolers, Christian schools are targeted by government and others, and God is no longer relevant to anything in our culture anymore except for church and religion. He's been banished to the churches. Truth number 5, the Abrahamic covenant, which is basically if we obey God and follow His principles and His rules, He will bless us. Our founders understood that there was great blessing. It wasn't that we had this ruling God over us that looked for us to make a mistake so He could point it out and condemn. They understood God to be that one, if we honored Him and we honored His covenants and we honored His laws, He would bless us, and He has blessed us greatly. But the deceptive transition began way back, as all of this did really, with Karl Marx, who interestingly enough was Jewish, and then from then moved on to it was Fabian Socialists, the anti-Christian movement, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and eventually then infiltrated our government policies so that honoring God and His laws is no longer part of our government in terms of a focus or an importance or a priority of our government. You also had the feminist movement, the homosexual movement, the anti-Christian movement, all of them together. Basically, this whole chart, starting from Karl Marx on, has been for the purpose of moving us away from God's laws, obeying God's laws, to man's laws. Number 5, the resulting deception then, of course, as a result of what that is, we now have a much more oppressive government. Our freedoms are being removed very rapidly. We're no longer a nation of laws but of men, and we're about to come full cycle, hopefully not, but we're going to crown a king or a tyrant in November, and Lord willing, we won't. Truth number 6 is common decency, and that was the idea that Americans would look out for others in addition to themselves, that others, their neighbors, other people, that, were just as important as themselves. It was written on our Statue of Liberty, the kind of nation we were, welcoming the poor, the tired, the hungry, that sort of thing. We were a nation that embraced and valued other people as much as we did ourselves. The deceptive transition was that we now have a desensitization towards death and the suffering of others, and a hardening of our heart, which is very much promoted in media and in Hollywood. And then there is an inundation of the message, the only thing that really matters is you, and all you have to do is open up a magazine or look at any kind of commercials or ads or whatever. It's all about satisfy you, meet your needs, you're all that matters. So the resulting deception of that is that we now have an entitled people that do not look to the needs of others. They only seek what is best for themselves, self-centeredness. Now let me just stop right here and say, we certainly understand that there are many, many exceptions to this rule. Obviously there are still good and decent people. When America has tragedies and certain things happen, like the tornadoes in the Midwest or whatever, we are quick to help one another. We are just talking about an overall prevailing attitude and sense that has changed significantly from the days of our founders to where we are today. And even though we are still good and we still do help one another, overall there has been a real loss in terms of appreciation for that. Public virtue is no longer valued, public virtue being the good of the community over the good of self. And there is no sense of responsibility, more or less, for anyone but themselves, if that. And finally, truth number 7, personal accountability to God. The deceptive transition again began with Karl Marx to replace God with the state, thereby eliminating all accountability to God. And the part of that deceptive transition also included man-centered messages that replaced God's word and His truth. And the resulting deception of that is that there is a denial of God, therefore there is no accountability. And if there is no God, there can be no absolute truth. And therefore there is no sin, and if there's no sin, then all people are free to do as they wish and what they deem is right. And God may exist, if you still acknowledge the existence of God, He may exist, but He's been stripped of all of His authority.
So, in summary, our nation has been greatly deceived by an enemy whose ultimate goal is to bring us to destruction. Joseph Stalin, the former dictator of the Soviet Union, said this: "America is like a healthy body, and its resistance is threefold. Its patriotism, its morality, and its spiritual life. If we can undermine these three areas, America will collapse from within. Morality and spiritual life is now what we deem it to be as mortal beings in the civil arena. The only area with some life left in it is patriotism, and it is nowhere near what our fathers and grandfathers considered it to be. We have been deceived in very subtle ways, slowly over the course of time. You've just been reminded through this presentation, partially based on the documentary Agenda: Grinding America Down, of the calculated and systematic plans to destroy America from within. From Karl Marx to the Frankfurt School, the Fabian Socialists, and the Communist Party USA, the past 100 years has introduced political correctness, multiculturalism, moral relativism, and shared prosperity, that would be spreading the wealth, along with the creation of many other radical organizations. Finally, with the anti-Christian movement firmly intact, the supplanting of the NEA, and a myriad of other groups, and those who agree with this agenda, their mission is almost complete. By attacking Judeo-Christian values and undermining the foundational principles held by our founders, Stalin believed they could do the job without firing one shot. They believed that once our morality and spiritual life, our values and principles born of these ethics, were basically eliminated through deceptive teaching, it would gradually change the norms of a civil and decent society, and we would destroy ourselves. They couldn't have been more right. The questions now before us are these. Do we want the America our founders gave us? Are we willing to admit our failure to perceive the deceptions which invaded our culture? Do we have the courage to do what is necessary to turn the ship of state around? Are we willing to count the cost? The answers to these questions will chart the course for our nation in the near future. If we believe our founding documents that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are intenable rights given by our Creator, then we must choose to be changed by the living God from the inside out and agree with what He says about us. Anything less than this leaves us with man and his human nature making the same mistakes again, something that we have no longer the ability to afford. George Washington included this statement in his farewell address to the nation, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. America has a divine destiny as a shining city on a hill, which has not yet been completely fulfilled. Whether this happens or not depends upon us." And we thank you.